And now, it's time to join Marvel Editor-in-Chief C.B. Cebulski and Executive Spider Editor Nick Lowe as they team up to trace the comics history of everyone's favorite webhead in Marvel Comics, celebrating 60 years of the amazing Spider-Man.
D23! How we doing?
Everybody having a good show? Can you hear us back there? All right.
I'm going to need a louder confirmation back there. Can you hear us back there? Can you hear us in the front? Can we get a big Spider-Man welcome? There we go.
All right. All right, let's test their spider knowledge just to make sure we got the right crowd here.
All right.
With great power, there must also come great responsibility. All right.
His web shooter sound effect is. There we go.
All right, I think they passed the test.
I think so too.
They were just telling us backstage that this is the fullest this room has been for D23 just yet. So thank you to all the Marvel fans. Thank you to all the Spider-Man fans.
So great. I mean, we assume, you want to sit down?
Yeah, why don't we sit down?
We assume that you guys are here because Spider-Man is the greatest character in the history of fiction. Can I get it? Can I get an amen? Right? We all go to the Church of Spider-Man with Saint Uncle Ben, Saint Aunt May. Right. Well, we are so glad to be here with you today. Like he said, my name is Nick Lowe. I'm the Spider Editor at Marvel, and we have Editor-in-Chief C.B. Cebulski. I do know your name.
Yes, you do. We've been working together long enough, I hope.
It's true. It's almost 20 years.
Yeah.
Crazy.
So I have a question that I like to ask the audience before we start these panels. And it's about your origin story with Spider-Man. Because everybody here knows and loves Spider-Man and knows the legend of Peter Parker and that amazing cast of characters, both heroes and villains, that he has in his life. But, you know, people come into comics, come into Spider-Man in many different ways. So I'm going to ask take a poll just by people raising their hands. Who first met Spider-Man, Peter Parker, in a comic book? How many people out there?
Okay.
All right.
Good amount of hands. What do you say, about 20% maybe?
Yeah, about 20%. Now, how many people first encountered Spider-Man in an animated series? Yeah, a lot. Oh, yeah.
A lot of hands. That probably gets us to about 40, 50%, something like that.
All right. And how many people first encountered Spider-Man from the movies?
Okay, very good. Still a lot of hands. Not as much as the animated shows.
Not as much as animated.
What about video game?
Video games?
Okay,
couple hands here and there.
Hands.
Yeah.
Well, that counts as animated, right? Electric Company. But let's see, Electric Company. How many people there? Okay, a good amount.
All right.
A good amount. That's awesome.
Newspaper strip. Good one. Good.
Oh, right, good call. Good call. And or the live action TV show?
Oh, did you say the MTV show? Oh. Not many people remember that one.
And how about you, CB?
For me, it was comic books.
All right.
I of course, the Electric Company was a big one, but for me, my first encounter with Spider-Man was a comic book. I don't remember the exact issue, unfortunately. But how about you?
I mean, I think it was probably underwear. Probably any other underwear first experience?
Underoos.
Yeah. But other than that, it was. I think the first full story I got was from an episode of an animated show for the '90s Spider-Man cartoon, and then I read some reprints of comics. But that's all right. But we're not here to talk about my life story or your life story. We're here to talk about Spider-Man's life story.
60 years now.
60 years, and it is not only amazing, CB. It's beyond amazing.
It is beyond amazing. So I think we got a little trailer here to start off the panel. Let's see how this goes. Do I have to click again?
Maybe. No, there you go.
Awesome.
Woo!
I just want to thank Michael Cho, who was the artist who did a lot of the artwork in there through the interstitials between the comic book covers.
So incredible. We'll be talking a little bit about something else Michael Cho did later, I believe, as well.
We will.
So keep your ears peeled for that name, Michael Cho.
And this panel is being live streamed, we can't forget. So hello to everybody who's watching at home, maybe to families and friends of ours, ex-Spider-Man creators, editors. Thank you all for being a part of this with us. If you couldn't be here in Anaheim, you're watching where you are in your homes. So, all right, trivia question. Spider-Man's first appearance was in? Amazing Fantasy 15.
The comic that started it all, Amazing Fantasy 15.
And the date of publication was? 1962. What day? Anyone?
Not quite. Well, the cover says August, but that was actually a little known fact. I don't know how little known it is, but when you get usually the month of the cover is when the newsstand was supposed to take it down. But it actually came out on June 5th, 1962. Incredible. This cover, of course, by Jack Kirby, not one of the creators of Spider-Man, but Steve's cover. Steve Ditko, who co-created Spider-Man with Stan Lee, did a cover, and the story goes Stan wasn't thrilled by it and by the drawing, so he went to his other right-hand man, Jack Kirby, and he did this cover here.
Yeah, and in 1962, just to give you some context to what was going on at the time, as you see here, the comic was 12 cents. Gasoline was about the same price, 12 cents a gallon. The average price of an American home was $13,500. And a college education at Harvard University was $1,500 in 1962. So
I think that's what my Harvard education cost me. I did not go to Harvard. I'm not bragging.
But, you know, in this story, there was a short story in the back of Amazing Fantasy 15. We were introduced to Peter Parker, the, bespectacled, bumbling, nerdish high school student.
Yep. And they were trying stuff out. This was an experiment that Stan and Steve put together that their publisher, Martin Goodman, was not all that thrilled by. He thought no one would read a comic that has spider in the title. People hate spiders. Stan and Steve disagreed.
Yep.
But as they were experimenting, they tried things like the little dots in Spidey's eyes that you see him there with the robber that we get in that one panel, and the blue spider on the back of his suit that eventually, as of Amazing Spider-Man #1, is red there, but all throughout this issue it's blue. But of course, it's also where we first meet Aunt May and Uncle Ben.
Is that true, Nick?
Well, CB, it's not.
I know. So we guarantee you're going to learn things in this panel about Spider-Man you've never known before, because before this, Nick, myself, Tom Brevoort, executive editor, a bunch of people did a lot of research because there's a lot of urban legends and things around the backstory of Spider-Man. And we're going to give you some secrets today.
Yeah,
all right?
True.
So the first one is that Uncle Ben and Aunt May, or at least those names, did not first appear in Amazing Fantasy 15. Yep. They had been used before.
Yep, in Strange Tales 97, which came out 3 months before Amazing Fantasy 15. There's this story called Goodbye to Linda Brown. And Linda Brown has an Uncle Ben who has a mustache in here, unlike Peter's Uncle Ben. But Aunt May looks pretty much the same. But this has to be the first appearance of Aunt May and Uncle Ben.
Yeah, but there couldn't have been another appearance of these characters before this, could there have been, Nick?
Oh, there actually is. 2 years earlier, in Rawhide Kid number 17, we get Rawhide Kid's origin, the origin of the outlaw, and his uncle's name is... Ben. And in that story, Uncle Ben dies and teaches Rawhide Kid a lesson that he has to help people. And so, one part that we're still in our research period, I wish I could report a yay or a nay to you. Now, as far as we know, Stan did not have an Uncle Ben, but we'll keep looking and we'll report back maybe next year.
Now, is it just me, or does that look more like Uncle Stan up there in the orange?
It sure does, especially in his 70s style.
Yes, exactly.
Mustache. But Peter's Uncle Ben Spider-Man did not wear the purple cowboy hat and purple pants, unfortunately.
Yeah, but it's not uncommon in comics, especially back in the day, for ideas and names to be reused. A lot of comic characters, you may or may not know this, even to this day, are named after the friends and family members of the creators themselves. And this was a theme that was started really back in the day, as you can see here. But, you know, moving on to the actual creative team that created Peter Parker, they made Spider-Man, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko.
Yep. Stan and Steve came together. Neither could have done it alone to make this character, and that's one of the things that I love about working in comics is the collaboration. And so here in the center, that's a portrait by Phil Noto, but the other art on this is all by Steve. It's Steve's self-portrait on the left hand or the right-hand side of that image right there, and on the left-hand side, you have the how Stan Lee and Steve Ditko created Spider-Man, and those are Ditko's drawings of Stan and of himself on there, and they made comic book magic. But I mean, these are two of the greatest creators in comic book history, of course. Spider-Man was not their only creation, but it is my favorite and to me the best comic book character and the best fictional character, period. Take that Sherlock Holmes, take that James Bond, it is Spider-Man. Yep.
And you know, Stan and Steve had a working relationship for years before this.
Yep.
You know, before the Marvel Age kind of launched with Fantastic Four #1, you know, Alice Comics, Marvel Comics, Stan was there with Steve, with Jack, you know, with Wally, with a lot of these creators doing romance comics, doing sci-fi comics, doing war comics. But when it came to Spider-Man and when they were creating the story, you know, Stan really felt that Steve was the artist with that kind of quirky, more whimsical style, the less realistic style that could make it look a little bit weird, like literally a human would be embodied by a spider.
And one of the things also that publisher Martin Goodman was not excited about was a story starring a teenager, a story starring a high school student. At least that's how the story goes. Yep. And I think that was another reason why Stan went to Steve Ditko, who drew great teenagers and, like, you know, spindly, not these like big superheroic people. For a spider, you don't necessarily want that superheroic physique of that. And I think that's partially probably why he went to Steve on this. And of course, they made comic book magic. I think we're up to our next urban legend here.
Yeah, there's a lot of urban legends surrounding the myth of Spider-Man, and we're not debunking any or saying one is more true than the other, because there's just, you know, there's a lot of them been put in print. There's a lot that you've seen on screen in interviews with Stan. But there's one thing that, you know, that the people always say is that this was the one shot that they had to create Spider-Man, that they were doing this one story, this short story, and that Martin Goodman said, your careers live and die by this story. If it just fails, there will never be another Spider-Man story. But, you know, that is not true because of...
In the letters page of Amazing Fantasy 15, they actually talk about how Spider-Man is going to be one of the features in Amazing Fantasy moving forward. And you can kind of see it when we go to Amazing Spider-Man #1. Stan would sometimes claim that it was so popular that's what led them to doing Amazing Spider-Man, which is true. But that wasn't the original plan, right? And because you can tell, because Amazing Spider-Man #1 and Amazing Spider-Man #2 are each divided in half with 2 stories per issue, and those would have been in Amazing Fantasy 16, 17, 18, and 19. It isn't until you get to Amazing Spider-Man #3 that you get a full-length comic book story of Spider-Man. And that was always something when I was rereading it when I became Spider editor that blew my mind, and was looking at that. And they're weird stories too. Like they're definitely figuring it out. It's like some of my favorite TV shows. You don't really know what the TV show is until, you know, 5 or 6 episodes in, until they figure out what it is. And that's definitely what Stan and Steve were doing.
Yeah, without a doubt. And, you know, look at these covers here. You know, these 10 covers were some of the first, you know, year of Spider-Man. The iconic characters that were created at this time that are still around today. And then, you know, one of the things you also have to remember is that, you know, they didn't know that they were creating a universe back then. These guys were just telling stories month by month, hoping that the comic was going to be successful enough to continue. The other thing that you realize from back here, and we're going to get to this a little bit later, is these comics were being created in real time. The characters were aging as if they were in real time, month by month and year by year.
Because they didn't know how long they'd keep going with this. They certainly didn't think that we'd be here talking about Spider-Man 60 years later. There was nothing like that in the culture at the time. It's amazing.
Yep, and then here you have Doc Ock, you have Electro, Mysterio,
Vulture, Mysterio.
And then, then that all led to one of the first big ideas that came in together. Let's put all the villains together on a super villain team.
Yup. The Sinister Six, Vulture, Electro, Craven, Mysterio, Doc Ock, Sandman. They all come together to kick Spider-Man's butt in one of the greatest comic books of all time, The Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1, Stan and Steve. I don't know how they did that and the regular monthly comic of Amazing Spider-Man. It has some of the best art ever done. You can also see Steve developing. I mean, he'd already been drawing comics for a decade at this point, at least. But you see him coming into his own and developing with each successive issue. This issue has a splash page for each of the villains. It's incredible. If you've never read it, do yourself a favor. There's so many versions in print. I think we just put out a new True Believers volume, our new single issue reprinting this annual. It is fantastic.
Or on the Marvel Comics Unlimited app.
Yep. Yeah. Any Marvel Comics Unlimited subscribers out there?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see some of you.
Yep.
I am as well. I love it. I was rereading some Spidey on the plane coming out here because we're both New Yorkers.
Yep. Like Peter.
Yep, it's true. And thank you. Yeah, any other New Yorkers here? Okay, there we go. I like that corner over there. Well done. But it's an incredible comic. Treat yourself. But as you were getting into CB, that the characters were aging kind of along with the comic as it came out.
Yep.
And so we get to Amazing Spider-Man 28, where Peter graduates from high school.
Yep. So people forget it was only a few short years that he was in high school before he graduated in the comics.
Yep. 28 issues of Amazing Spider-Man plus Amazing Fantasy 15. He's only in high school for that long, like 2 years and change, and he graduates high school. And I remember reading that blew my mind. And so we see it here. This is still Stan and Steve, of course. You're introduced to the Molten Man, who's Liz Allen's half brother.
And if we were doing this in Marvel Comics today, in Marvel time, we'd have like 2 years before he even goes to college. He'd be joining his summer vacation. He'd have a job. He'd be having all kinds of trouble.
Yep.
But no. In Spider-Man, in Amazing Spider-Man back then.
Yep. And then you get him in college, like only 3 issues later. In Amazing Spider-Man 31, Peter goes to college for the first time, and he meets. There are a couple major characters that we meet for the first time in Amazing Spider-Man 31. Can I have anyone shout out there? Gwen Stacy and Harry Osborn. Absolutely. Yep. We meet two of the most important characters in Spider-Man history here in ASM 31. Stan and Steve still creating absolute comic book magic and leading into the next couple issues are my favorite issues of Amazing Spider-Man, with Doc Ock as the master planner and Spider-Man lifting up the unliftable weight to get out of there. So one of the greatest moments in comic book history. And this is also around the time, though, that Steve Ditko, just a few issues later in Amazing Spider-Man 38, is his final issue, and we get our first creator change in Amazing Spider-Man history. And who starts drawing Amazing Spider-Man 39? John Romita.
John Romita Sr., as we call him these days.
Absolutely. At the time, he was just Jazzy John Romita. And he came on, and it was a seismic change for Spider-Man. I mean, one of the greatest illustrators of all time, one of the greatest comic book storytellers of all time, one of the greatest creators of all time, and one of his creations is right there on the screen, the Rhino. Yep. And I love the Rhino.
Comic book characters and comic book series are often defined by the artists that are on them for runs.
Yep.
And it goes for all comic books, but especially for Spider-Man, there's been such classic runs by such creators, some lengthy runs, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But Steve and Stan came to the end. John came on here, and again, you just look at some of the changes that stylistically, artistically, that he brought to Spider-Man back then.
Yeah, like we said before, on the left is Steve Ditko's Peter Parker. He's got glasses. He's skinny. He looks a bit nerdy, maybe. But then on the right, you got John Romita, and I don't think John Romita has drawn a non-good-looking person in his entire life. I mean, like Peter's handsome. Even Harry's kind of handsome in his own way there. And then the next slide, we've got Gwen Stacy, and she's beautiful as Steve drew her, but she is just like unbelievably beautiful in the pencil and ink of John Romita.
Yep. And then, in my opinion, and don't boo me, You know, Gwen Stacy will be the eternal love of Peter Parker's life. However,
Yep.
soon after this, we met.
Yep. Who do we meet?
Mary Jane.
Mary Jane Watson. I mean, we saw glimpses of her as Steve Ditko was still on, and Steve would always do this trick where he'd never show. He would have people talk about Aunt May's friend Anna Watson's niece. But we never saw her. He'd always hide her behind stuff. But this was a kind of a classic bit, if I'm right.
Yeah, a lot of a big cartoon back in the day in the 60s was called Little Abner.
Yep.
And that was a gag that Stan and Steve both liked from Little Abner, where they would talk about things but never reveal it, leave the reader guessing day to day, because it was a daily strip, about who that person was and never show them. And Stan and Steve kind of kept that gag going here.
Yeah, like the Great Beauty, like the Little Abner, the Great Beauty, but they'd never want to show her because then you'd never live up to it.
Yep.
Like you could never draw her beautiful enough, and that was kind of what Steve was doing here. But John Romita was up for the challenge. I mean, look at Mary Jane in her very first on-panel appearance there.
You know, one of the iconic lines, of course, in comics, even in fictional history. You know,
Face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot.
Yep. And then, you know, everyone thought that Peter Parker was this, you know, kind of nerdy high school kid. But look at him here a couple of years later.
He's doing just fine.
Yeah.
He's doing just fine. He gets the interest of two of the most glamorous and beautiful women in comic book history. Unbelievable. But yeah, he didn't. But John, I should say this. I said before that John never drew anyone that wasn't incredibly handsome. But he could also draw villainous people who looked really scary, such as one of the greatest villains in comic book history, the Kingpin. Yep. Yeah, any Kingpin fans out there? Yep. Oh, a little thing. So I got in yesterday from New York and went to eat dinner at the park at Disneyland. And while walking around after, I got to for the first time ride the Millennium Falcon ride, which was awesome. But on the walk to Millennium Falcon ride, we saw Vincent D'Onofrio himself walking around Disneyland yesterday. Yep. It was so cool to see him, and just to kind of like have oh look, it's Vincent. Yeah.
But he was just down on the Marvel Studios stage with Charlie Cox. We were talking a little bit more about Daredevil Born Again, the new D+ show coming next year. But the thing with that is that from later in the 80s on, Kingpin became mostly known as a Daredevil villain, as he expanded onto the Netflix shows and onto the D+ screen. But he started as an Amazing Spider-Man villain.
And he was there for a long time in Amazing Spider-Man, and Johnny and Stan created him, and it was and what a creation. He ended up being an ongoing villain for Spidey, like you said, until the 80s when the Spidey creators kind of stopped using him as much, and Frank Miller came on the scene and put him in Daredevil, and the rest is history. But we also are getting in the same time period where Spider-Man expands beyond just comic books.
Beyond amazing.
Ooh. Because Stan's role evolved at Marvel.
Yes.
At the time, he was writing and editing just about everything, but then his role expanded, right, CB?
Yep, exactly. So, you know, you all know now Marvel as this, you know, giant company that has our hands and our characters in every kind of medium, from, you know, comics to film to TV to animation to games to bedsheets to underwear, and it could go on and on and on.
Underwear.
But, you know, you have to remember back then in the late 60s was when Hollywood was just dipping its toe into looking for content, and Marvel was at the front, and Stan would make regular trips out to Hollywood to really try and sell Spider-Man beyond just the printed page.
Yep.
And one of the first things that I'm sure some of you remember, there we go. Is the original cartoon series.
Yep. Like with the theme song classic, the animation classic. I love when you'd see Spider-Man. Like I was sadly not alive yet for it. I'm far too young. But I remember watching. I've watched a bunch since then, and you see Spider-Man swinging across the screen. No buildings to be found, where his webs were above the tops of the buildings. You see him swinging. But such a classic show, and I loved. And we'll get into some of the places where we've seen him since. The moment in Into the Spider-Verse where they got the meme making Spider-Man pointing at each other. But this cartoon is just incredible. And seeing J. Jonah Jameson on the the TV screen, so cool.
I think that's the first time I've heard you say Spider-Verse in a normal voice.
I mispronounced it. You're right.
Yeah.
Does anyone know the correct pronunciation for that word? There we go. Spider-Verse. Panagos. That's how you correctly pronounce it. You guys, you all must have been confused with what I was talking about there since I pronounced it so poorly. Thank you, Ryan Panagos.
Yeah.
There we go. Agent M himself is here.
And what's the day before Friday?
Thursday, of course. Thursday. That's one of my quirks. I refuse to call it what much of the world calls that day. It is only Thursday to me. Anyway.
So, moving on. Sorry.
But as much as we talk about TV, it always comes back to comics. To comics, the beating heart of Marvel. To me, the beating heart of the world is comic books. And so we come back, and one of the coolest things, Stan and artist Gil Kane has now come onto the book. And Gil tell this incredible story in Amazing Spider-Man 90, one of the most intense and heartbreaking issues of Spider-Man history, ASM 90, whereas the death of Captain Stacy. Police Captain George Stacy, he dies. Spidey's fighting Doc Ock on the roof. He uses a new fluid that comes out of his web shooter that makes Doc Ock's arms fight each other and fight him. And while Spidey defeats Doc, they knock some bricks off the roof, and Captain Stacy knocks a little boy out of the way and gets crushed by these bricks, and Spidey gets him out just as he's dying, and he reveals
that he's known his identity all along.
Yep,
so much for the secret.
Yep, he knew that Peter Parker was Spider-Man, and he kept that secret. He didn't turn him in, even though Spider-Man was a criminal in the eyes of the police, and he tells him to take care of Gwen Stacy.
Yep. Which he does, right?
Well,
we'll get to that later.
He does really well for about 30 issues at least, I would say, which is a lifetime if you're talking these early comics, right?
That's true. That's true. But the other thing that that Stan and all his co-collaborators were never
never shy about
was addressing real world issues. It was Marvel is the real world. It takes place mostly in New York City. It's expanded out since then. But
it's the world outside
your window. Because Stan really wanted people to believe that you could put the comic book down and think that Spider-Man would swing by or Iron Man would fly by. So they would address some real world topics. And back in the day, in the late 60s, and early 70s, the drug epidemic was everywhere. It was on the news, and it was affecting real people and invading college campuses.
Yep.
So Stan felt
which is one of the main hotbeds of popularity for the Marvel Comics. Stan would go and do lectures at college campuses all around the country where this drug epidemic was hitting, and so they put a story in there with Harry Osborn as a drug user, and where they delve into the horrors of drug use and what it can do to your life. It's another harrowing story that goes places that comics didn't go at that time. Comics didn't really delve into that very often. But Stan showed his courage as a storyteller and did it there. And it's around this time also that the job of writer of Amazing Spider-Man changed hands.
Yep. So as we said earlier, Stan was busy in the late '60s trying to expand the Marvel brand and get the characters in different mediums. So he was spending a lot more time out on the West Coast and ended up coming out here almost semi-permanently at this point. So his protege, Jerry Conway, came on and took over the writing duties of Spider-Man back in the day.
And one of his chief stories he wanted to tell, he wanted to show again the depth of what comics as an art form can go to, and the tragedies that even comic books can take you to, and the greatest tragedy probably in Marvel Comics history, I would think, the death of Spidey's girlfriend Gwen Stacy at the hands of the Green Goblin. And it is one of the most touching and heartbreaking moments in comic book history as Gwen dies, and it shakes Spider-Man to his core. And there's another kind of urban legend out there. There's some people who sometimes it's been told that Stan didn't know this was happening and was furious when it happened, but I don't think that's the case.
No, yeah, the story goes that when reader reaction was very negative about this, that Stan had come back from a trip from Europe, or he come back and he said, "Oh, I was on a trip to Europe for a long time. I didn't know a single thing about this," and they did this kind of almost behind his back, and that's definitely not true.
Oh, and Stan himself has confirmed, or he had confirmed that he was there and that he read it before it left, and loved the story and thought it was incredibly powerful. And then another bit of trivia too for you out there. What bridge was it that Gwen was thrown off of? Yes, in the comic itself, and this is so crazy, in the comic itself it names it as the George Washington Bridge, but what bridge did Gil Kane draw? the Brooklyn Bridge, and so like trying to dig into what happened there, it's really hard to even say. But even there were editions of this that Marvel published afterwards that corrected it to the Brooklyn Bridge very soon after, in the coming years after Amazing Spider-Man 121 came out, where they changed it in the comics to Brooklyn, and ever since then, with some exceptions, that we've referred to it as the Brooklyn Bridge. But when in the very first print, it was said the George Washington Bridge, which is on the completely opposite end of Manhattan to where the Brooklyn Bridge is.
And there was also another thing. I was at a convention recently where Jerry Conway was talking about this issue.
Ooh.
And he said that him and John Sr., who drew the issue.
Who inked it, right?
Sorry,
Gil Kane drew it, yeah.
Gil Kane drew it, sorry. Him and John Sr., because John Sr. introduced, or was a huge fan of Gwen and was always upset about this, were still always at odds about how Gwen Stacy died. Because after he inked it, they didn't put the neck thing in. It did the Green Goblin killer when she fell off the bridge, or did Peter grabbing her with the web snap her neck? And they said that they still argue about that, and they still debate about that.
And in the comics, it has been confirmed that she was dead already. That several times that the Green Goblin killed her and Spidey did that. But that is still a fan debate that rages from the publishing of this comic.
Exactly. And then, during this time, as Marvel continued to grow beyond just the comic book line, it continued to grow in the comic book line as well, because there was only that one Spider-Man title for a long time. But then suddenly, as the Spider-Man's popularity continued to grow and grow, we got multiple Spider-Man titles that started coming out over a period of years.
We had Marvel Team Up, and then they showed that which is always Spider-Man and someone else. But that wasn't it, because not long after, we got Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, written by Jerry Conway, and it was, and this is the first time really that Marvel had experimented in having two monthly comics starring the same character. But it wasn't just in comics, because it's right around there that, as some of our audience mentioned, the Electric Company came out with new animated tales of Spider-Man on TV as the popularity of Spider-Man got larger and larger in the culture at large. But it always came back to the comics. It always came back.
And then, so Spider-Man graduated high school, Spider-Man went to college, and then about a little 4 years later, maybe?
In 185, the Peter Parker graduates from college. So 185, so he was a
little bit more than, they were getting more into Marvel time at this point.
Yeah. So things started stretching out a little bit longer. He was there for what, probably about 10 years at that point. So he was in college for 10 years. But
it's like Pluto from Animal House,
There we go. Yeah, we can all relate to. Some of us can relate to being in college longer than usual. But so as the comics kept charging on, kept telling like more and more incredible stories, it once again branched out into the greater culture at large. As in 1977, we had the live-action television series with Nicholas Hammond as Spider-Man. And who all watched that show?
Big fans out there? Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. What a cool show. I love the design of that of the Spider-Man they used for that TV show. It was such a cool show.
This was I remember when this started on TV.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So neat. I love the shape of his lens there. It looks so awesome. And while this is going on, we also had the debut of the newspaper strip. Stan and John, they kicked it out into newspapers around the country as it became. I remember this was right around '67 as well, and I remember in the '80s, as I first began to reading that every day in my newspaper, the Spider-Man comic strip. It's incredible. Stan wrote that for years as well.
Yep.
And John did incredible art there as more and more of the country got to know Spider-Man as just a pop culture phenomenon.
And this was one of those instances, too, very early on, where the comic book series were multiple series running at the same time, and they were all in a connected universe. But the strip was a little bit separate.
Yeah.
It was telling different stories at a different pace. So it was kind of almost the multiverse coming to be born here. So it was two different continuities that were happening at that time.
And it wasn't just between the two coasts where Spider-Man was starting to get popular. He started having worldwide comics appeal and character appeal.
So yeah, you know, Spider-Man they came out with a Sentai series in Japan at this time. Stan had flown over and worked on it with Toho Productions. This introduced the giant robot Leopardon.
Yeah, and his spaceship, and his ship, the Marvelar. So cool.
And this really set the tone. You can read all about it online, about how this kind of set the tone for a lot of the later Sentai series. You know, for things like, you know, Power Rangers, Ultraman. Not Ultraman, sorry, Kamen Rider, things like that. And also, if you're interested in the origin of this Japanese Spider-Man series, there's a episode of Marvel 616 on Disney Plus. Has a full documentary with a lot of the actors, the producers from back on in the day that gives you so much fun information about the creation of this show.
It's incredible. The documentary is incredible. The show is incredible. It is insane. He comes from Planet X. Like it's the villains are crazy and fun and awesome. And so treat yourself to watching that documentary and then to watching some shows. It is well worth it. But you know, as our common refrain is, it's still all about the comics. The comics are always driving it.
One of the most you know, iconic series for any Spider-Man fan is probably this one here, The Kid Who Collected Spider-Man. And this is just yet another example of how not every story is about the hero winning. You know, in the real world, again, going back to telling stories about this is a story about a kid who had cancer and whose one wish was to kind of meet Spider-Man.
Yep.
And Peter Parker, knowing this kid, you know, is a big fan, comes into his room and talks to him and tells him about Spider-Man and reveals his identity to the boy.
It's such a powerful story. I just reread it on my airplane out here, and you know, it's an incredible issue. It's got a Thunderball story, and then it's got The Kid Who Collects Spider-Man. If you haven't read it, treat yourself, because it's beautiful.
And, you know, and again, it's just the villains aren't always physical. In this case, the villain being cancer ends up winning in the end, tragically. But again, reinforce this as one of the strongest stories told by Roger Stern.
And Ron Frenz.
And Ron Frenz.
Yep.
So if you haven't read this story, highly recommend it. It's really how emotional and how gripping a comic book story can be without much superhero action in it.
And it holds up. It definitely holds up. It's half that issue. It's incredible.
And now, Spider-Man is traditionally known for his red and blue costume. But there was a period in the 80s during a little event called Secret Wars where there was a color change.
One of the first major costume shifts for Spider-Man happened in Secret Wars, where he gets this black costume on an alien planet, and it leads to some incredible stories.
Yeah, and originally this issue was Secret Wars was teased in a comic series. Almost Marvel was putting out a news magazine about some of the upcoming stuff back in the day called Marvel Age, and the costume was originally black and red. But they thought that was a little too similar, so during the production, early production of this issue 8, they decided to change it to black and white.
And if I recall, I think it's Rick Leonardi designed that as the black and the red.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's so incredible.
And then here, Jesus, why the name is escaping me? We just talked to Mike Zeck.
Oh yeah, Mike Zeck drawing Secret Wars. Yep.
And now, so Spider-Man was introduced to the black costume. The symbiote, as it later became to be known, came back and wore the black costume in Amazing Spider-Man 252, which eventually led to the creation of Venom.
Any Venom fans out there? Yes, one of the greatest villains in Spider-Man history.
In Marvel history, I think.
Absolutely. It's just so incredible, so scary, so terrifying. And I mean, and it also is during the kind of introduction of Todd McFarlane as an artist. And we'll get more into Todd as this goes along as well. But Michelini and McFarlane, they bring you Venom. They take the black costume, they put it on. Who wears the Venom symbiote? Eddie Brock.
Yep.
Oh my gosh, and what a crazy history that character has had. We live in Venom's world right now. Not only the movies, those insanely awesome movies, but in the comics right now, we came to one seminal end of a Venom ongoing series where, because over the years, Venom becomes a hero in his own right, and now we're with Donny Cates and Ryan Stegman finished their run, and right now we're in a run with Al Ewing, Ram V, and Brian Hitch. It's incredible to see his journey.
I know, it was around this time too. So not only did we meet what would become one of Spider-Man's greatest villains, which was one of the down times of his life, but Spider-Man at this time also had one of the happiest moments of his life. Well, short-lived, but...
well, kind of long-lived.
Long-lived, all right.
But we get the marriage of Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson. Now, the story behind this is kind of fun because the way that it was always told to me and the way that I think it's come out in history is that Stan wanted to do it in the newspaper strip. And they were trying to decide, well, but if we're going to do it in the newspaper strip, we should do it in the comics. And it was one of those times where those two stories kind of came together. And it is incredible the way this happened. And the dress, I believe it was Willie Brown who designed it.
Yeah, Willie Brown designed the dress, yep.
Who is an amazing fashion designer. He is incredible. His design is so gorgeous. But it wasn't only in the strip and in the comic. We had the marriage in real life.
So yeah, they hired actors to play Peter as Spider-Man and Mary Jane, and then look at the attendees of the wedding there in that middle panel. So you have his amazing friends, Iceman, you got Firestar there, right? But
the Hulk, Captain America.
Who's hanging out in the back to kind of object to the marriage?
Yeah, the Green Goblin. Yeah. They shouldn't invite Green Goblin to the wedding. He should be on the no list. I mean, he would definitely have said something, speak now or forever hold your peace, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, this became national news. I mean, it was just not...
It was at Shea Stadium where the Mets played at the time. Any New York Mets fans out there? We got a few. I'm a Mets fan. I'm a fan of the Cleveland Guardians. I'm a fan of the New York Mets because I grew up in Cleveland and I live in Queens now. And you got to be a Mets fan. They're incredible. Anyway, so they got married at Shea Stadium.
Had a cake and everything.
Yep, it's true. And had a huge party after that. I was just sad I couldn't have been there at that time. That would have been amazing.
So we go from one of his greatest villains, a sad moment, to one of the happiest moments of his life, to one of the most tragic stories in Spider-Man's history, Kraven's Last Hunt.
Oh my God. This, J.M. DeMatteis, Mike Zeck tell one of the greatest stories in Spider-Man history, Kraven's Last Hunt. It went over three of Spider-Man series, an amazing, web of, and spectacular, and it bridged between those three over 6 parts. What an incredible story. That's another one that I reread on the plane coming out here to get ready for this panel. And it holds up so well, and it still packs a heck of a punch. And I don't want to spoil the end of it, because if you haven't read it, do yourself a favor. Probably not for the youngest children in the crowd.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's all kinds of crazy stuff. Kraven hits Spidey with a dart that has crazy hallucinogenic drugs in it. It's wild. But if you haven't read it, treat yourself. It is unbelievably good.
And JM is doing a sequel for next year, Kraven the Lost Hunt.
Yep, the Lost Hunt.
Yep.
It takes place in a very particular moment in Spidey history, so you got to go pick this up. Yep. It's going to be wonderful.
And now we were talking earlier about the creators really defining Spider-Man. And here, going forward, we get into some creators who have become, synonymous with the Spider-Man in the 90s.
Yep, from left to right, we've got Todd McFarlane. Yep, any big Todd McFarlane fans out there? Yeah, I know I am.
Todd is here at the show. He was down, he's doing a line of Avatar figures, so he was here at the show doing signing
awesome.
stuff. Yep.
And then in the middle, we have Eric Larson. Any Eric Larson fans out there? Yes. And on the right, we've got Mark Bagley. And Mark Bagley fans out there, yes.
Mark Bagley, who is still, to this day, drawing Spider-Man.
It's true. It's true. And doing a great job. He's launching a Spider-Man book that comes out in October. But more on that later. I don't even know if we're going to get to that later in this panel.
Yeah, we got to start speeding up.
We do.
I know these people are here waiting for something else from us.
It's true. It's true. So, Todd McFarlane wrote and draw his own Spider-Man series that not only was one of the biggest series launches of its time as far as the importance of comics, but it was also the highest selling comic at that time of all time. Yep. Because it sold 2.5 million copies. So mind-blowing. Such an incredible comic. That's another one to seek out if you haven't read it before. The art is unbelievable. The story's unbelievable. So cool, so crazy. That cover, it just burned into your retina when you saw it.
Yeah, it has been homaged so many times from all different media, all different artists, all different companies.
So getting back, we talked about Venom before, but Venom wasn't the end of the story of symbiotes, because Venom spawned Carnage.
Let there be carnage.
Yep. One of the scariest characters of all time. Well, who is the host of Carnage? Cletus Cassidy, serial killer, as cellmates next door to Eddie Brock. And as the symbiote joined with Cletus, it became Carnage. Led to some of the most intense stories of all time. Maximum Carnage, so much great stuff. But this was kind of like getting to something like, again, with that 2.5 million copies of Spider-Man, you'd think that Spider-Man couldn't get any bigger, but he did.
He did.
Soon after, we had the animated 90s Spider-Man animated series. Anyone big
lots of fans of this one here, huh? Wow, nice.
My kids, I have 3 little kids, and they've gotten into this series now, too. It's on Disney+. If you haven't watched it, it's incredible. It also holds up. It's so great. But this was a huge part of Spider-Man history that came out. And then as this animated series came out, we got to another one of the biggest stories that had its roots way back in Spidey. Because when Spidey was in college, one of his professors was... Well, there was Professor Connors, but no, Miles Warren, we heard out there.
Yep.
Miles Warren, who was also... The Jackal. And he cloned Peter Parker, and he cloned Gwen Stacy. And at the end of that story, you'd think that you saw the end of these clones, but you didn't.
But no, one of the most beloved and or hated Spider-Man stories of all time, the Clone Saga.
The Clone Saga. You met Ben Reilly, that you met Ben Reilly, who was either that Spider clone back from that story way back when, or the true Spider-Man. Who thinks that Ben Reilly's the true Spider-Man? We got some. Who thinks Peter Parker is? Now. Well, you might not know, but for some time it was purported that Ben Reilly was, and that ended up not being the case in the comics. But it was a long-running story that sold, as much as it was controversial, it sold huge. But that was one of the biggest stories of the 90s, as over the several years of the 90s, leading to, we're coming up on some of the other biggest moments in Spider-Man history.
Yeah, there was also always, even to this day, as Nick and I edit, talk comics and talk to writers, it's about keeping the ideas fresh and always making sure that they're new reader friendly is a term that gets thrown around a lot. And it's making sure that people don't feel that the Spider-Man universe or the Marvel universe is impenetrable. They see the movies, they play the video games, they want to read the comics, but that we have to make sure the comics feel that they're for everybody, that you could come in and not be bogged down by 50, 60 years of history. So it was around this time in the early 90s that we introduced Ultimate Spider-Man, which people might know.
Was that anyone's first comic here, Ultimate Spider-Man? A couple. There's a couple
people, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Ultimate Spider-Man's what got me back into comics. I loved the X-Men when I was in middle school. And before that, I'd read some of Distinguished Competition stuff, but that was never where my heart was. But it was when they put these Ultimate comics, both Ultimate Spider-Man and the Ultimates, online at Marvel.com. You could read the comics there. And Ultimate Spider-Man, incredible. Brian Michael Bendis, Mark Bagley told some of the most incredible Spider-Man stories.
Yep, and this is when I started. I was in the Ultimate office when I started at Marvel.
Yep, there we go. And it started in 2000, right?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, this slide is blank.
Oh.
All right. Oh.
And it came out just before the movies started coming out. We had the Sam Raimi directed Spider-Man. I think some people in here have seen the Spider-Man movies.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And several incarnations of it. We had Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man for 3 movies. We had Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man for 2 movies. Yep. We had Into the Spider-Verse with Miles and an incredible cast for 1 movie and some more coming up.
Yep.
And then we've had Tom Holland for 3 movies.
Yeah.
You want to ask your question?
No, I don't want to ask the question about who everyone's favorite Spider-Man is.
No, we're getting too much trouble if we do that. We're getting too much trouble. And this made Spider-Man a cultural juggernaut, the likes of which no one has ever seen. Like, everyone around the world, in large part due to like the animated series and then these several series of movies, everyone around the world knows who Spider-Man is. And that's so incredible to see as a fan and as an editor and all that kind of stuff, that this character that started as like a backup feature in a comic has become this cultural juggernaut is just so amazing to me. But it always comes back to the comics.
Exactly. And
the creators who are the lifeblood of comics. 2 of those creators in not only in the early 2000s that we also want to talk about is he had started in the 80s with we have John Romita Jr.
So the son of John Romita Sr., who came on early in Spider-Man's career.
Co-creator of Hobgoblin, of so many also incredible characters who drew him in the 70s, in the 80s, and today, but we'll get into that later.
Yep.
But it also had the Spider-Man debut of one of the other greatest Spider-Man artists of all time, Humberto Ramos.
Yep.
We got some fans here, and
Humberto, where are you? Humberto's here somewhere.
Here he is. Humberto, stand up. Ladies and gentlemen, Spider-Man legend Humberto Ramos in the house.
Humberto's going to be signing downstairs later at 5:30.
At 5:30 in the celebrity, what's it called? The Celebrity Corner? I don't know.
Yeah.
Talent Central. It's just like I said, right? Talent Central. Yeah, so we'll be down there along with Humberto. You got to get him to sign some comics, and we'll be talking about some comics.
You all might have a comic soon enough that he's going to be able to sign for you. Two other great artists, and then two very controversial storylines, which still people talk about to this day.
Yep.
And that's the best thing for us is when we create stories that really polarize the audience, polarize readers and fandom, and get them talking. And fans still debate from one side or the other.
Yep.
Should Peter and Mary Jane be married or not? Because in One More Day they were split up.
Yes, that covers by Joe Quesada. One More Day's story where their marriage was dissolved through supernatural means. It is a lightning rod of a story, like you said, and it led into another huge era, which is Brand New Day, when Amazing Spider-Man came out 3 times a month, created a bunch of new villains, set a whole lot of things going, and it led to Humberto Ramos alongside writer Dan Slott, who came in. Any fans of this 10-year run right here? Yep. Big time. Humberto and Dan introduced some new costumes. They introduced new characters, new stories. It led to the mind swap of classic Spider-Man villain Dr. Otto Octavius and Spider-Man and the Superior Spider-Man, which is one of my favorite stories of all time. Any Superior Spider-Man fans here?
Which is one of those things. This was, one of the comics where the internet was very heavily involved in this comic, and it was the first time where you kind of heard about a lot of trolls talking about Superior Spider-Man, because they didn't even read the comic. They said, oh, Otto Octavius, Dr. Octopus taking over Spider-Man's brain. Oh, that's dumb. That's stupid. That's the worst story ever. That's going to be terrible. No one's going to like that. We got a lot of slack for it. And then people actually read the comic, and now it's considered one of the best Spider-Man stories of all time. So don't trust the internet.
Yep. I wish I'd worked on it. I came in at the very, very end as Spider editor on the last 3 issues of the main Superior series. But I remember when I first read Dan's plot, I cried. And the second last issue of that Superior Spider-Man story is one of the best Spider-Man issues of all time as well. I cried when I read the plot. I cried when the art came in. I cried when I read the script and the comic all together. It is so beautiful and so awesome. You have to read it. It's nuts and it's so wonderful. But that wasn't the only major story going on at that time either.
No, there's a new character that we introduced that most people tend to know and love.
Yeah,
Miles Morales.
Any Miles Morales fans? Yes, I know I am. So in the Ultimate Universe, Ultimate Peter Parker died. Miles Morales took up the mantle of Spider-Man and changed history. Proved forever and always that anyone could be underneath that mask.
Yep.
What an incredible character, and it drove home the coolness and the importance of the multiverse, and this was, of course, Miles was co-created by Brian Michael Bendis and Sarah Pichelli, but it paved the way for one of my favorite stories, one of the ones that I worked on from the very beginning, Spider-Verse. Where we introduced Spider-Gwen. Any Spider-Gwen fans out there?
Yeah.
Just before then, Silk, which was a character that Humberto co-created with Dan Slott out there, was introduced. Years earlier, actually, CB and I worked on it. Spider-Man India was created. But all these characters from the multiverse came together to be part of Spider-Verse, where they fought Spiders-man, which is just 1,000. Well, he came in Spider-Geddon, which is a different story. Spider-Geddon is another really cool story. But a Spiders-man is 1,000 spiders that take the form of a human and think that they're kind of a human. But this Spider-Verse story spawned the movie Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse.
I'm sure everybody here has seen.
Wait, what movie were you talking about? I think you pronounced that wrong. Spider-Man into the what?
Spider-Verse.
There we go.
All right, you got me to do it.
There we go. Got him. Got him. And it's crazy. Like, you know, once when I was a kid, Spider-Man comics didn't, like, there weren't many like Spider-Man, there were no movies, right? But now that there are these movies, sometimes it feels like the stories they tell are all 60 years old or 40 years old. But Spider-Verse came out in 2014, and it was only 4 years later that Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse came out.
Yep.
Crazy. But also in other media took Spider-Man on, like the amazing PS4 Sony video games Spider-Man. Incredible. And another quick turnaround in comics. We met Mr. Negative in 2007 in ASM 546, and again, what is it? 11 years later, he shows up in the video game. Yep. So cool. On the next slide, you'll see him and Spidey fighting on a very accurate New York subway car.
Yeah, I think Bill Roseman, the games team, has been here this weekend, had some great Marvel Games announcements, too.
Oh, my gosh. Those are incredible. So excited.
And now, Nick, moving on to some of your new highlights.
Yes. So we just, back early this year, launched a new Amazing Spider-Man #1, written by Zeb Wells, drawn by John Romita Jr. In the honor of the 60th anniversary, we kicked off this new volume, and I'm so excited by it. It's such an incredible volume. Zeb is, if he's not, I don't think he's in the house here. Zeb, are you in here? Nope, I don't think he's here yet, but he's on his way here right now, and he'll be at that signing at Talent Central. There we go, at 5:30. You come down and you can get his signature as well. And we very recently did Amazing Spider-Man Legacy 900. Woohoo. Yeah, it is a callback. It is our inspiration for it, and Zeb's inspiration for it was the Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1, and he and artist Ed McGuinness did their love letter to the Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1. We bring back the Sinister Six, the original Sinister Six, and they're joined, and Spider-Man has to join them and become part of the Sinister Seven? What? Pick it up. It's incredible. It's one of the biggest stories we've told all year. The main story is 70 pages long. One 70-page story that's all Zeb, all Ed McGuinness. It's nuts and it's wonderful. And we'll actually, I'm not even going to get into what else is in that issue because we'll be talking about it later because we are going to be down on another thing down at the
live stream.
At the live stream booth down on the main floor. So come by and see us. But coming up, we got to tease stuff here too. Coming up this December is Dark Web. It is a huge Spider-Man story. It's a huge X-Men story. So we did a story called Amazing Spider-Man Beyond, where Ben Reilly has returned, and he got turned into a new Spidey villain called Chasm through a bunch of machinations. You see him; he's got the glowing green eyes on this image that you're seeing here. So the most famous Spider clone of all time gets together with the most famous X clone of all time, Madeline Pryor. Any readers of Inferno back in the day out there? Yes. Well, the Inferno, the embers of the Inferno light again, and they are turned into a new flame, which is the Dark Web. And Madeline and Ben spin a new dark web over the city of New York. Venom gets into it, of course. Al Ewing and Rob V got in on the action.
I think Kamala Khan is involved as well. Ms. Marvel herself.
Ms. Marvel, exactly. We get Black Cat and Mary Jane are a huge part of it, with a new Black Cat and Mary Jane series starting up. Yep. And we get a new character called Hallows Eve that you'll meet in Amazing Spider-Man 14 for the first time. We've shown her on some covers. You can go look it up. Hallows Eve. She is so cool.
And thanks to Ryan Stegman for the promo image here.
Yep.
Now, was anyone here in 2 years or 3 years ago at the panel that Tom Brevoort and I did here in 2019?
I see some hands.
All right. Well, as you know, at that panel, we gave out a free exclusive comic. The only time that Mickey Mouse and the Disney characters are allowed to cross over with the Marvel characters are here at D23. So, at the end of this panel in a few minutes, everybody here will be getting not one, but two exclusive comics. Covers drawn by Humberto Ramos himself down over here.
Woo, Humberto! Look at
one cover is of Spider-Man, gifting the D100 cake to the original 6 in the Disney crew. You look for a lot of Easter eggs back in the bookshelf when you get this. And the second is a follow-up with the Disney characters gifting Spider-Man and the his amazing cast of characters, the Avengers, their Spidey's 60th cake. What we would kindly ask is when you do leave, please only take one. Have fun, take one of each. You get both covers, but last year people took multiples and we ran out. So please keep that in mind.
Yeah, one per person so that everyone can get one. That's very important to us.
One of each cover, yeah.
One of each, yeah.
Yep.
And that's a cover to Amazing Fantasy 1000, which is our 60th anniversary celebration. It just came out last week. It's got a story by Neil Gaiman. It's got a story by Veep creator Armando Iannucci. It's an unbelievable comic. Michael Cho has a story in it who we talked about before.
Exactly.
Any Spidey and His Amazing Friends fans out there?
Yep.
My kids love it. Kids around the world love it. It's incredible. Check it out on Disney+. And we're running out of time. We have one more video to share with you because in San Diego there is an incredible museum exhibit called Spider-Man Beyond Amazing. And we got a video. You got to go to this exhibit. It's so cool.
It's with our friends at Semmel, who have been doing wonderful things for us in exhibitions around the world.
And if you're a Marvel Insider, hang around too. Dance to the beat. Yep, Comic-Con Museum in Balboa Park, San Diego. And if you go there, you'll see an original art of a cover that Umberto drew as well. It's unbelievable. Okay,
yeah.
And again, we're running out of time. Our last slide, if you are part of the Marvel Insider program, here's a special code that can get you 10,000 points. It goes so fast. And it is only, limited to 5,000 redemptions. It's going to go fast, but get that code, DG72T. And if it's live streamed, you're in.